One thing I realize I haven't explained in my paper is where the Pays de Vaud is. Probably most of you know. I'm talking about the French-speaking part of Switzerland, north of Lake Geneva. Lausanne is the capital. And in 1536 it was conquered by the Bernese. That's kind of essential to know to understand. Okay.
Temporary.
In 1539, John Calvin, writing from exile in Strasbourg, admonished André Zebedee, pastor in Orbe, in the Pays de Vaud, as follows. Quote, "You have no reason to take such great offense at Bucer's retractions. Since he had erred in his teaching concerning the use of the sacraments, he rightly retracted that part. If only Zwingli had made up his mind to do the same, for his opinion on this subject was both false and pernicious." Falsa et perniciosa. Labeling Zwingli's teaching false and pernicious was not a way to win friends and influence people in Switzerland in the 1530s. Nor was singing Bucer's praises likely to be well received so soon after the disastrous Wittenberg Concord negotiations. These lines, penned from Bucer's home city, would have signaled to all in the region that Calvin had jumped ship and abandoned what was seen as the true evangelical teaching for the treacherous Lutheran, Martin Bucer. Moreover, the letter's recipient, André Zebedee, was a devoted disciple of Zwingli. In 1539, Zebedee was also still friends with Calvin and his associates Guillaume Farel and Pierre Viret. After this point in time, however, it became increasingly difficult in the Pays de Vaud to be both a friend of Calvin and a disciple of Zwingli. Indeed, I begin with this letter from Calvin because in many ways it marks the beginning of a parting of ways that would characterize much of the history of the Reformation in the Pays de Vaud. The early evangelicals in the region, starting with Farel himself, lined up fully behind Zwingli. Indeed, probably more than anyone else, Farel was responsible for spreading Zwingli's thought throughout the Suisse romande. Calvin also, during his first years in Geneva, at the very least aligned himself with the Zwinglians in Vaud and Bern. But his embrace of Bucer in Strasbourg, together with his contempt for the state-controlled church model dominant in Zurich and Bern, led to long-lasting tensions between his followers, the new Calvinists, and the old guard Zwinglians in Bern and the Vaud. Most of the leading intellectuals among the French speakers, Viret, Farel, Théodore de Bèze, Mathurin Cordier, followed Calvin. But probably the majority of French-speaking pastors in the region remained dedicated to Zwingli's ideas about the Eucharist and ecclesiology. Of course, the division between Calvinism and Zwinglianism in the Pays de Vaud has long been recognized, since at least Abraham Ruchat's 18th century Histoire de la Reformation de la Suisse and Karl Bernhard Hundeshagen's Die Konflikte des Zwinglianismus, des Luthertums und des Calvinismus in der Bernischen Landeskirche. Most of the earlier scholarship, however, focused on the great men and their theology, notably Calvin and the Bern pastors. The lesser pastors of the Pays de Vaud have generally received short shrift. The anti-Calvinists of the Vaud, men like Jean Lecomte, Thomas Malinque, Antoine Marcourt, Jean Morand, Jacques Lecoq, Claude Dulon, and most importantly, André Zebedee, remain largely obscure. Zebedee, as we will see, was a major opponent of the Calvinists, and indeed of Calvin himself in the 1540s and 50s, yet there is not so much as a dictionary or encyclopedia entry on him anywhere, as far as I know, much less a full-length biography. Several Calvin biographies do not even mention him, and he appears only once in the 2009 Calvin Handbook. A search for Zebedee in the Calvini Opera comes up with something like 280 hits, though. He's in the correspondence repeatedly. Part of the reason for this, no doubt, has to do with the lack of sources. But at least part of that problem stems from the larger issue. In the long run, at least in French-speaking work, in the French-speaking world, and the English-speaking as well, the Calvinists won. Thus, Viret's and Bèze's letters survive, at least some of them, but Malinque's and Zebedee's do not. Moreover, Calvin scholarship, I suggest, has long tended to rely on Calvin's published works more than on his correspondence. Thus, the enemies we meet in Calvin scholarship are mostly people he wrote against, but with whom he had little, if any, personal contact. Jacopo Sarletto, Albert Pigius, Joachim Westphal, and others. In the Pays de Vaud, even though Zebedee was a thorn in Calvin's side for much longer than Pierre Caroli was, Caroli is probably better known since Calvin wrote a book against him, but not against Zebedee. Finally, another reason for the relative anonymity of Calvin's opponents is that over the centuries, the Calvinist-dominated historiography has tended to marginalize and vilify them. Thus, Pierre Caroli was an apostate whose, quote, natural instability did not allow him to follow consistently a single and clearly defined line.
Amen.
Zebedee was, quote, a quarrelsome character, rash, vain, unmanageable, wholly without tact. Jerome Bolsek was, quote, a famous slanderer who wanted to pass to posterity with a note of infamy. All characterizations by 19th and 20th century scholars. Fortunately, some recent scholarship has begun to rectify this situation, with, for example, Gabriel Berthou's book on Antoine Marcourt and Reinhard Bodenmann's recent studies of Pierre Caroli and Jean Leconte. Bodenmann chose the title of his book on Caroli well, Les Perdants, the losers. These were, to use his terms, those who, quote, held other notions of reform than those that ended up being imposed in the second half of the 16th century and who were left to sink into anonymity. The truly ironic thing is that in the Pays de Vaud of the 1540s and 50s, these losers repeatedly won. In 1542, the Bernese magistrates effectively imposed a Zwinglian theology of the Eucharist and ecclesiology on the Vaud. In 1555, after complaints by Zebedee and others, they issued a virtual ban on all things Calvinist in the region. And in 1559, it was Viret and his Calvinist colleagues in Lausanne who were expelled from the Vaud. Zebedee, Malincre, and Leconte, and many others stayed. And they were able to stay largely because they accepted the Zwinglian theology dominant in Bern. Now the Bernese preferred to refer to themselves rather than Zwingli, and so we don't actually see Zwingli's name in many of the documents from the era. Instead, the Bernese repeatedly refer to our Reformation, or more specifically to the 1528 Bern Disputation. But of course the dominant figure at the 1528 Disputation was none other than Zwingli. When Zwingli's name does come up in the conflicts of the 1540s and 50s, it is often actually in reference to Calvin's letter to Zebedee that I opened with. Zebedee shared Calvin's letters with many others who then saw for themselves his characterization of Zwingli's sacramental theology as false and pernicious. This would forever color the struggle between Calvinists and Zwinglians in the Pays de Vaud. So I have three parts, one on Farel, one on Calvin, and one on the later end. So part one, Guillaume Farel, the original Zwinglian in the Vaud. In 1526, when Guillaume Farel arrived in Aigle in the Pays de Vaud, he was a convinced Zwinglian. Farel had, of course, been part of the Meaux group under Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples and Guillaume Brissonnet. In 1523, however, he left Meaux and went to Basel, where he became good friends with, and indeed lodged with, Johannes Oecolampadius. Through Oecolampadius, Farel was introduced to the other major Reformed theologians. In May 1524, he left Basel intending to go to both Zurich and Wittenberg. But faithfully, he only made it to Zurich, where he met Zwingli for the first time. I say faithfully because it was at exactly this time that the Eucharistic controversies blew up between the Lutherans and the Reformed. So after Zurich, instead of continuing on to Wittenberg, Farel returned to Basel and then went to Strasbourg. Thus, he found himself in the thick of the Reformed opposition to Luther, and even participated in it. In October 1525, he sent a letter defending the Reformed view of the Eucharist to the Lutheran Johannes Bugenhagen, along with the Strasbourg delegation that had been sent to Wittenberg. Just weeks before this, Farel had sent his first extant letter to Zwingli. Only 4 other letters between them survive. All are from Farel to Zwingli, none the other way around, and all of the other 4 were written from the Pays de Vaud. It is clear from the letters, though, that Zwingli was in fact writing him back regularly. Thus, as is usually and sadly the case, they likely exchanged many more letters than those that have survived. In his first letter to Zwingli from the Vaud, Farel gives high praise to Zwingli's 1527 treatise on the Eucharist, Amica Exegesis, which Farel says, quote, brilliantly and skillfully exposes the matter, You are driving out the obscuring shadows. A year later, Farel encouraged Zwingli to, quote, persist in your efforts so that Christ might completely free the church from all contention about the water and the flesh. Obviously a reference to the sacramental elements. Clearly, the Farel of the late 1520s would not have agreed with the Calvin of the late 1530s about Zwingli's teaching on the sacrament. Otherwise, in his letters, Farel informs Zwingli of the progress of the Reformation in the Vaud, seeks his assistance in finding new suitable ministers, and laments the weakness of his friends in France who are unwilling to declare themselves openly for Christ. In his last letter to Zwingli, sent just 10 days before Zwingli's death, Farel expresses hope that the Genevans too might be willing to hear the gospel, but he worries that Catholic freeboard might hinder it, for he complains, quote, the Bernese do not work with the same diligence for Christ's glory as the free bourgeois do for the Pope's favor. This critique of Bern is important, for I think it presents part of the explanation, at least, for why the theologically Zwinglian Farel ultimately sided with Calvin rather than with the Zwinglian pastors in Bern. For Farel, I believe it wasn't so much their doctrine of the Eucharist that he objected to, as it was their emphasis on the state-controlled church. We should remember that from Farel's perspective, as well as from Calvin's, I would add, their experience with state-controlled churches was generally negative, while the Swiss tended to have a more positive view. In Zurich and Bern, the city councils took a leading role in establishing Protestantism, and for the most part, there were hiccups of course, worked hand in hand with the city's evangelical pastors. For Farel and Calvin, the lesson of the state-controlled church in France was one of hindrance and persecution. It was only when pastors and other evangelicals freed themselves of state control, in places like Meaux, in Bourges, in Nérac, that true reform could even begin to start taking place. Remember, too, that all of Farel's time in Basel was spent there before the city abolished the Mass. And even when Farel was working for Bern in the Vaud, he had to fight against Bern's almost constant efforts to rein in his polemical language and iconoclastic tendencies. And so Farel strove to work as he pleased wherever he went throughout West-Schweiz, sometimes more successfully than others. But over time, he built up a network of French-speaking evangelicals in the region. A few, like Viret, were native-born, but most came from France fleeing persecution. And almost all adopted what was essentially a Zwinglian theology. After Neuchâtel abolished the Mass in 1530, the evangelicals used the city as a base of operations, made all the more important when the printer Pierre de Wingler set up shop there. Probably the most important books published there were Farel's Manière et Façon and his Sommaire. The Manière et Façon, for the first time, gave the nascent French evangelical communities a vernacular liturgy for worship, modeled on the rites of Bern and other cities. Farel's Sommaire gave them effectively their first catechism, a brief explanation in the vernacular of the rudiments of the Reformed faith. These two works were so important, for they shaped the thought and practice of virtually the entire Francophone evangelical community, and shaped it in a way that was decidedly Zwinglian. Part 2. Calvin the Zwinglian. It was in this environment that Marcourt, Melancre, Lecomte, and other later enemies of Calvin started their Protestant careers. And it was into this environment that Calvin stepped when he arrived in Geneva in 1536. And he fit right in. One thing Calvin scholars have become more attentive to in recent years are developments in his thought and attention to historical context in which these developments took place. No longer can the Calvin scholar say, as once was commonplace, that Calvin never changed his mind. On his early Eucharistic teaching, Wim Janse has suggested that the years 1536 to 37 mark Calvin's Zwinglian phase. He points to the lack of any notion of instrumentalism of the sacraments as means of God's grace. And the historical context also appears to bear this out. One of his first public appearances in the Suisse Romande was at the Lausanne Disputation in October 1536. He intervened only twice and was content to let Viret, Farel, and Caroli, among some others, do most of the talking. Viret's explanation of the Eucharist at the disputation ran as follows, in what I would suggest is very Zwinglian fashion. Quote, to eat the flesh and drink the blood of Jesus Christ is nothing other than to believe in Jesus Christ. that he gave his body on the cross to death for us, and poured out his blood to wash and purge us of our sins. Those who perfectly believe this eat the flesh and drink the blood of Christ, even if they do not eat and drink the bread and wine in the Lord's Supper. Soon after the disputation, however, Pierre Caroli presented the first substantial challenge to the unity of the Reformed pastorate in the Vaud. As is well known, the debate with Caroli centered not on Zwingli and Calvinist theological disagreements, but on Calvin's doctrine of the Trinity and on Caroli's liturgical prayer for the dead. Nevertheless, the split foreshadowed the theological divisions to come. What is less well known about the Caroli affair, at least until Bodenmann's recent book, is that Caroli had friends in Romandy, in particular Marcourt and Lecomte, as well as Jean Chaponeau and probably others. Traditionally, Calvin scholarship has tended to portray Caroli as isolated, a lone wolf howling fruitlessly at the great Calvin. But it is now clear that Caroli had supporters, and many of these supporters would end up being lifelong enemies of the Calvinists. Another frequently ignored element of the Caroli affair, Bruce Gordon's Calvin biography is an exception, is that throughout the discussions, Calvin's chief ally in Bern was the arch-Zwinglian pastor Caspar Wegener. By contrast, the Lutheran Peter Kuntz was perceived by all of the French-speaking pastors in the region as their chief opponent in the city. And so, despite the personal factions that developed around the Caroli affair, nearly the entire Reformed pastorate of Romandy through 1537, including Calvin, was basically Zwingli. So what happened? In a word, Bucer happened. Through 1537 and 1538, Martin Bucer descended on the Swiss Confederation, aggressively pushing the Swiss to adopt the Wittenberg Concord that he had hammered out with Luther. Bucer had a certain amount of success in Basel and Bern, but was roundly rejected in Zurich. Bullinger, in particular, developed a deep distrust of Bucer. A significant part of the negative reaction among the Swiss stemmed from one of the things alluded to in Calvin's letter to Zebedee, Bucer's retractions. As part of the negotiations with Wittenberg, Luther insisted that Bucer publish a recantation of his earlier Zwinglian views. He did so, to the great dismay of the Swiss. The final rejection of Bucer's Wittenberg Concord took place at the same 1538 meeting in Zurich, where Calvin and Farel tried to present their case to the Swiss on their recent expulsion from Geneva. Immediately afterwards, Calvin went to Strasbourg, where Bucer's influence on him became increasingly significant. The Swiss, by contrast, refused to have anything more to do with Bucer. This parting of ways, therefore, set the stage for future conflicts between Calvinists and Zwinglians in the Vaud. Part 3, Marcourt, Zebedee, and the Zwinglian resistance. The conflicts began almost as soon as Calvin and Farel left Geneva in 1538. Their replacements, Antoine Marcourt and Jean Morand, were called by the Geneva Council without consultation of the pastors. Marcourt was well known in the region. He had been pastor in Neuchâtel for several years and had written 3 short works on the Eucharist, namely the famous placards of 1534, the Déclaration de la Messe, and the Petit Traité de la Sainte Eucharistie. Gabriel Berthoud has noted that Marcourt's theology faithfully reflects that of Zwingli. Marcourt's magisterial appointment to Geneva likewise reflects the Zwinglian model. But Calvin and Farel's aversion to the state-controlled church rendered the call illegitimate from their perspective. Soon the trouble spilled out from Geneva into the Pays de Vaud, and the Bernese finally had to call a meeting in Morges to reconcile the 2 parties. All of the chapters of the Vaud were told to send representatives to the meeting, suggesting this was not just a Geneva affair. This developed the whole region. In the end, a compromise was reached. Marcourt and Morand admitted they should have consulted the other pastors in the region about their call, and Calvin's allies acknowledged them as legitimate pastors. But the factionalism continued. Soon afterwards, André Zebedee began to sing Zwingli's praises in the Vaud. First, there was Zebedee's unfortunately lost letter, to which Calvin was responding in 1539, calling Zwingli's opinion false information. Later that year, Zebedee circulated 2 poems praising Zwingli. One was his translation of a poem, possibly by Leo Jud, that praised Zwingli along with Oecolampadius, Erasmus, and others, not Calvin. The second was an original poem, which reads as follows, quote, "On Zwingli, impossible to hope for one greater. Perhaps we must beseech our times to give us one equal. His learned mouth, his upright heart, his zealous spirit, all pressed toward the praises of the one God. O strongest defender of the evangelical word, O you who dared to die bravely for Christ and country. In a letter to Farel, Calvin commented, immediately after extolling Luther's great superiority over Zwingli, quote, Zebedee's ode to Zwingli does not please me at all. On his return to Geneva, Calvin began to spread his new Butzerian-influenced ideas among his friends, especially Farel and Viret. Indeed, I would argue, and I'm sure I'm not the first, that the period after Calvin's return to Geneva actually marks the beginning of the Calvinist era. But it was an inauspicious beginning outside of Geneva. In 1541 to 42, in Neuchâtel, Farel tried repeatedly and failed repeatedly to implement Calvinist church order, including the election of pastors by the rest of the chapter, the monthly celebration of the Eucharist, the establishment of a consistory with the power of excommunication, and fraternal corrections. The Neuchâtel City Council rejected all of Farel's requests and instead issued the Ordonnance pour la Ville, which prohibited excommunication and clearly indicated that coercive power in punishing immoral behavior lay exclusively with the secular authorities. In the Vaud, Viret had no better luck. His efforts in 1542 to implement Calvinist ideas on the Eucharist, church goods, and discipline went nowhere. First, the Bernese passed Zwinglian ordinances on the Eucharist in August 1542. Soon afterwards, Viret complained about Baron's administration of the ecclesiastical goods seized in the Vaud after their conquest of 1536. The Baron magistrates believed they could do as they wished with them. Viret, who had been counseled by Calvin, argued that goods once consecrated to the church had to remain for the use of the church. Here, Viret was opposed in Lausanne by none other than Antoine Marcourt, who, after he had left Geneva, had taken a position in the Vaud, and who in this case supported the rights of the Baron magistrates to do as they pleased. In addition, Viret began to push for the church's right of excommunication. He was rejected on all fronts. The next major fight came in 1547 and 48, when Zebedee and Viret entered into a bitter fight over the power of the ministry and the interpretation of the Eucharist. Viret and his Calvinist colleagues pushed for a more Calvinist understanding of both, highlighting what they saw as the pastor's real power of the keys to bind and loose by forgiving or retaining sins, and arguing for Christ's real presence in the Eucharist. Zebedee stoutly resisted and denounced Viret's teaching to the Bernese. And it was in the course of this conflict that Zebedee appears to have pulled out the letter he had received from Calvin 9 years earlier. Zebedee's ally in Lausanne, Beat Comte, who had been one of the city's first pastors, wrote to the Zurich ministers, quote, Calvin, the Archbishop of Geneva, Episcopus, dared to write about Zwingli, that most learned man of blessed memory, in these words, his opinion about the matter of the Eucharist is false and pernicious. Beat Comte quoting Calvin's letter to the Zurich pastors. Later that year, the Baron pastor Nikolaus Pfister reported to Bullinger, quote, yesterday, André Zebedee gave me a packet that contained some letters sent to him from Calvin and others, from which you will be able to understand what those troublemakers think about the purer evangelical doctrine, which they call Zwingli. At the end of the conflict, Viret was allowed to stay in Lausanne, and Zebedee was transferred elsewhere in the Vaud. All the while, he continued to oppose Calvin and his followers. Zebedee's greatest victory came in 1555. This time, the issue that prompted the conflict was predestination, but clearly Zebedee had a more ambitious goal of removing Calvin's influence from the Vaud altogether. The conflict started as a continuation of the Bolsec affair in Geneva. In 1551, Jerome Bolsec had criticized Calvin's doctrine of double predestination, both in Geneva and actually in Beauvais in the Vaud. When the Genevans expelled him from the city at Calvin's urging, he was welcomed with open arms back in the Vaud. And he teamed up with Zebedee and Jean Lange, the pastor of Jossin. Together, they began publicly to label Calvin a heretic. In January 1555, they took a series of articles and excerpts from Calvin's works to Bern. The Bernese responded by prohibiting preaching on predestination and taking communion according to the ceremonies of the Calvinists. Calvin and his allies appealed to the Bernese. and they agreed to hold a hearing with all present, but once again, Zebedee and his Zwinglian allies prevailed. On April 3rd, 1555, the Barron Council officially declined to endorse Calvin's doctrine, and instead indicated it would not tolerate books or people found in their lands with messages contrary to our Reformation. Indeed, the council indicated that such books should be burned. The Bernese insisted that their officially approved catechism be used, not Calvin's, and they forbade the use of Calvin's institutes at the Lausanne Academy. Finally, the Barron Council indicated, quote, "We have been made aware of certain letters which John Calvin wrote and sent to certain individuals, in which he refutes and condemns Zwingli's doctrine of the sacraments, calling it false and pernicious. And in another place, saying that Zwingli's opinion is completely false. This worries us because in our disputation of 1528, this matter was debated by Zwingli and other wise and learned individuals, and was supported vigorously by Holy Scripture, and has been observed to the present day. Thus, we would have good and just reasons to complain about and bring Calvin to justice." Clearly, we're not fans. This decree from the Barron City Council provided fodder for Calvin's opponents for years. In 1562, François Baudouin referred to it in his treatise against Calvin. In 1565, thus a full decade after the event, the evangelical jurisconsult Charles Dumoulin mentioned it approvingly in his treatise against the calumnies of the Calvinists. To Calvin's enemies, Barron's decree was a delight. Here was one of the most powerful Reformed territories which had adopted the Reformation years before Geneva, effectively telling Calvin that his theology was not welcome in the Pays de Vaud. They would stand by Zwingli and the purer evangelical doctrine, as Pfister had put it. The Bernese did not budge from this position 3 years later when Viret and his colleagues in Lausanne made their final push for Calvinist-style discipline in the Vaud. Throughout 1558, the Lausanne pastors and professors pushed the Bernese to adopt a more Calvinist ecclesiology that would increase the power of the local consistories and give the church the right of excommunication. The Bernese refused them at every turn. And when Viret attempted to delay the Christmas Eucharist, the Bernese expelled him and his associates from the Vaud. Thus, the Calvinists, in this case, were les perdants. The Zwinglians had won. Conclusion. Despite the Zwinglian views of individuals such as Marcour and Zebedee, we must understand that devotion to Zwingli and his thought was not the only thing, and perhaps not even the primary thing, that bound together Calvin's enemies in the Pays de Vaud. Pierre Kerolli's theology was not particularly Zwinglian. Zebedee was also friends with Sebastian Castellio, who detested Zwingli for his persecution of the Anabaptists. Philippe de Ecclesia, a Genevan minister tied to Bolsec, was accused of preaching the very Lutheran doctrine of the ubiquity of Christ's body. And Bolsec himself does not appear to have been especially Zwinglian in his thought. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, we sometimes say in regard to foreign policy. This seems to have been the case with many of Calvin's enemies in the Vaud as well. Ultimately, the thing that tied most of them together, more than love of Zwingli, was hatred of Calvin. The odium Calvini is mentioned with some frequency in the letters of the 1550s. We should take this phrase quite literally. This was not polite disagreement over a few minor theological issues. It was bitterly divided factional enmity within the Francophone Protestant community of the Suisse romande that for too long has been ignored or brushed aside. Too often, Calvin's opponents have been mocked and ridiculed as ignorant or ambitious, and perhaps most misleading of all, treated as isolated individuals. They were not. They formed a network of opposition to Calvin in the Pays de Vaud and beyond. And this network emerged, at least initially, out of the desire to preserve the precepts of the early Reformation in Romandie, an early Reformation that owed most of its inspiration to the Zurich reformer Ulrich Zwingli. Thank you.